Hi everyone, welcome back to another video review by Mio Lessons. Back in January I tested the Olympus 300mm f4 Pro, and since then a lot of you have been asking about another lens that's been announced this year, which is the Panasonic 100-400mm. And so here we are. Before proceeding further, there's an important thing I have to say. Panasonic sent us this lens, and this lens is a pre-production sample concerning the exterior, but it's final concerning the optical quality, which is why I accepted to review it in the first place. Basically, the lens I got has a few issues with, for example, the zoom ring being harder to turn, or a few other small issues. Panasonic assured us that the final version of the lens that will be released on the market won't have any issues. I will check a final version as soon as possible to confirm that, and with that said, let's get started. The 100-400mm is designed by Leica and is one of the products made in partnership with Panasonic. The exterior is made of metal and it feels like a premium product. The lens is weather sealed against dust and water, but it is not freeze-proof. The lens weighs almost 1 kg, which is not light for a micro four thirds lens. However, it balances well with the GX8 and it is especially comfortable with the OMD M1. The zoom mechanism is not internal, so the lens protrudes considerably when you zoom in to 400mm. On the barrel, you will find 3 rings. The first is the focus ring, which is not mechanical. However, I found it precise when adjusting focus manually, even in video mode when used in combination with focus peaking and magnification on the GX8. Then we have a lock ring that allows you to lock the zoom at any focal length you want. Finally, we have the zoom ring. On the side we find 3 switches. The first can limit the focus distance from 5 meters to infinity. The second switch allows you to change from autofocus to manual focus. The third switch activates or deactivates the optical stabilization. The tripod mount mechanism is one of the features I appreciate the most about the lens. The collar is built in and can rotate 45 degrees, allowing you to change from landscape to portrait orientation. What is clever is that the 3 switches I mentioned before are on the collar itself, so when you rotate the lens, they always stay in the same position. The tripod mount can be detached and the whole solution is very compact. Finally, we have the lens hood, which is made of metal as well. You attach it to a sliding ring that you find at the front end of the lens. This sliding ring allows you to extend or retract the hood a little. I admit this is the only aspect I'm not really keen on. The difference is not huge between the 2 positions, and it is an extra element that can cause your hood to move more than you want. I would have preferred to have the hood retract completely over the lens barrel. The 100-400mm has an equivalent angle of view of 200-800mm if we refer to the 35mm format. The aperture is not constant and goes from f4 at 100mm to f6.3 at 400mm. The other apertures corresponding to the main focal length are f5 at 200mm and f5.6 at 300mm. I'll say up front, this 100-400mm really managed to surprise me when it comes to sharpness. Leica has designed a lens that basically gives you the best performance at the fastest apertures for all focal lengths. In addition to the various wildlife pictures I took, I also ran some additional tests at home to check sharpness completely. At 100mm, the difference between f4 and f5.6 is barely noticeable. At 400mm, it's the same thing. f8 is just a little sharper than f6.3 at moderate distances, and this is even more noticeable in the case of distant subjects. Still, at 400mm and f6.3, this lens is perfectly usable. Past f8, diffraction starts to appear, but sharpness remains decent up to f16. The results are slightly better at 300mm than at 400mm if I vary my distance from the subject to create the same composition. Here again, the difference is not huge. The bottom line is, this lens is sharp at every focal length and aperture between f4 and f8. The bokeh is not bad for a f4 6.3 zoom lens, and it managed to surprise me here as well. In some shots, especially for birds on a tree, you can come across some double lines and hard edges like in this example. However, the lens also has character and can deliver interesting autofocus backgrounds. It is not perfect but doesn't leave you completely indifferent. Even the results for occasional portraits can be satisfying even though this isn't the primary purpose of this lens. The 100 to 400mm can focus as close as 1.3 meters throughout the whole zoom range, which means you can get pretty close at 400mm. The lens doesn't have any particular issues with chromatic aberration or distortion. Vignetting is only slightly present at the fastest aperture and 400mm especially. Another thing worth mentioning is the flare you may encounter if you shoot directly into a powerful source of light. I tested the lens on both the Panasonic GX8 and OMD EM1. As far as the autofocus motor is concerned, there's nothing really to declare. It is fast, it is silent and works really well. In single autofocus mode, both cameras do well. Thanks to the depth from the focus technology, the GX8 has a slight advantage. I tested the continuous autofocus with birds in flight mainly, and the average percent of keepers I got was around 50%. Part of this is because of my lack of experience in tracking fast birds and my ability to keep them at the center of my frame. The OMD EM1 uses phase detection in continuous AF and delivers more constant results. Once it locks onto the subject, it rarely loses it. However, at times the camera can miss focus completely and either focus on the background or not focus at all, despite having the release priority set to focus. The GX8 struggles more in giving constant results in a burst. Especially when the bird is in the sky, it will tend to alternate between in-focus and out-of-focus shots. For birds in flight, I also found that limiting the focus distance to 5 meters infinity helps you achieve more accurate results. It doesn't make a huge difference, but unless you need to focus closer, I would suggest that you leave it like this. The lens features the Panasonic Power Optical image stabilization and is also compatible with the dual image stabilization of the GX8. This means that on that camera you can use both the sensor image stabilization and the optical stabilization at the same time. I tried to push the shutter speed as slow as I could, and the best result I got at 400mm was at 1/15th of a second. However, the keeper rate increases significantly when I set the speed to 1/50th of a second. For a real-world shoot, my advice is to keep the shutter speed at least at 1/200th of a second, and if you can, use a faster shutter speed to ensure sharpness like 1/400th of a second. I did achieve good results even at 1/100th of a second, as you can see right now, but not without various attempts. Also remember that the Panasonic GX8 suffers from severe shutter shock between 1/60th of a second and 1/320th of a second, and only the electronic shutter can solve the problem. It is not the best solution because you can encounter some rolling shutter issues, but there isn't an alternative with this camera. What's interesting is that the dual image stabilization system of the GX8 doesn't make a huge difference in comparison to the optical stabilization of this lens alone. I repeated the same test with the EM1 by turning off the 5-axis stabilization and using just the optical stabilization. Surprisingly, I got the same results. I managed to go down to 1/15th of a second and the keeper rate increased from 1/50th of a second. This might sound surprising at first, but I have a pretty good idea why. First, the EM1 has a better ergonomics, and when you press the shutter button you encounter fewer micro shakes than with the GX8. Probably the GH4 would give you more stabilization because it has nearly perfect ergonomics as well. Second, I also think that the dual image stabilization system of the GX8 tends to use the optical stabilization more when you use extreme focal lens like 300mm or 400mm. It isn't as effective as the Olympus Sync image stabilization. With the OMD series, you also have the option of using the 5-axis sensor stabilization instead of the optical stabilization. At shorter focal lengths, like 100mm, the 5-axis in-body stabilization has an advantage over the optical stabilization. At longer focal lengths, like 400mm, however, the optical stabilization gives you slightly better results. For video, the optical stabilization helps, but at the extreme focal length you will still need a tripod or at least a monopod for decent results. The optical stabilization also produces some jittering at the longest focal length. It is more visible with distant subjects. Overall, I can share a very positive feedback about this 100 to 400mm. It actually managed to surprise me. It is sharp through the entire zoom range and with the aperture you will use the most. It is also versatile. I admit I mainly shot at 300mm and 400mm, but at times I found it very convenient to be able to zoom out to capture a larger scene. Its primary application is definitely wildlife, but it can also come in handy for outdoor sports and other genres at times. The only real limit you will find with this lens is the slow aperture. Shooting at 5.6 or 6.3 means you have to raise your ISO to 1600 or even 3200 for birds in flight if there isn't much light in the sky, because you need a pretty fast shutter speed. You can use more reasonable ISO values for static subjects, but if you are in the shade again, you won't be able to keep your ISO at the minimum. Is this a problem? Well, it really depends on your point of view. Personally, I don't have any problem raising my ISO up with Micro Four Thirds if that means having an optimal exposure. It won't beat a DSLR with a larger sensor, but as usual you get the advantage of a lighter and more compact kit. The price is high at almost $1,800, but if you look at similar lenses from Fujifilm or Canon, the price is not that different. So yes, the lens is expensive, but it's also an excellent performer. I think this lens is the perfect middle ground between less expensive but less sharp lenses like the 100-300mm from Panasonic, for example, and the high-end Olympus 300mm f4 Pro. And I'm sure that many of you are wondering, is the Olympus 300mm that much better? Well, the Olympus 300mm has some advantages, the first being the fastest aperture of f4, which is not something to underestimate. I haven't compared the two lenses side by side at 300mm, but judging from my personal experience with the two lenses, I would say the Olympus lens is slightly sharper, but also the optical stabilization is more effective. However, if you don't have the budget or the confidence to use a Super Telephoto Prime lens, this 100 to 400mm can be the optimal choice if you want to take your wildlife photography to the next level. So as usual, thank you for watching. Don't hesitate to leave a comment below this video if you have any questions. Please subscribe to our channel and visit also miolesson.com, where you will find the full review of this lens with lots of full res image samples to see and download. Thank you again for watching and see you next time. Bye bye!